Hey folks, this is Ranker, and today we're going to go over the ABCs of Diablo 4. Between Fortify, Lucky Hit, Overpower, Diablo 4 has a lot of different game terms. And while many of them do have tooltips explaining what they are, what they do, those tooltips aren't always there when you need them, and even then you're sometimes left with questions, or they're lacking important context. In this video, we're going to go over 60 different game terms, what they mean, and give any extra info that can help you out in understanding how you can use this game mechanic to your advantage. I want this to be your comprehensive glossary for Diablo 4 game mechanics, so I'm going to timestamp every single term down in the description, and this will all be sorted alphabetically, so if you want to just skip ahead, you can easily find where's Fortify? I can see where F is. And just a note here, Diablo 4 is a new game. We don't yet know everything about it, so if any clarifications or additions or corrections need to be made, I'll do that in the description, and if necessary, put out another video. Oh, and I'll just have some beta footage rolling in the background, so you have something to look at other than my face. So, without further ado, let's start with a big one. All damage reduction, aka damage reduction from all sources, aka damage reduction. As you might guess, this reduces damage from all sources, and it applies after your damage reduction from armor and resistances. As this stat increases, additional bonuses become less effective. Damage reduction does not stack additively, but rather multiplicatively. This means that if you have one source that gives you 50% damage reduction, and then another source also gives you 50% damage reduction, you can't just add those two percentages together to get 100%. Doesn't work that way. Although, it would be nice. No, instead what happens is that each source of damage reduction reduces your damage one at a time. So the first source reduces your damage taken by 50%, then the next reduces the remaining damage by 50%. In this example, the math works out for that to be 75% damage reduction rather than 100. Then if you have a third source of damage reduction, that would again apply to the remaining damage you're taking. So that 25% left that you're taking half of that. So that works out to another 12.5% damage reduction, and your total then would be 87.5% damage reduction. And this continues on with each additional source, meaning you will never reach 100% damage reduction. So as you can see, each additional source is increasingly less effective. Think of it like this. You swim halfway across a pool. Then you swim halfway across the remaining half. Then you swim halfway across the remaining half, and so on and so on. You're never going to actually reach the other end of the pool. You're just getting close, but every time you're swimming a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and tinier distance. So damage reduction is definitely important, but if you already have a bunch of damage reduction, it might not be so important to get another source. At least if your option is getting something else more beneficial to you instead. And the last note we'll make about damage reduction here is that barbarians just natively have 10% all damage reduction. Alright, that was a big one. They won't all be this long.
Oh my.
That takes us to armor. Your total armor rating is the sum of the armor from your chest, your helm, your pants, your boots, and your gloves. Other things can also contribute to your armor, such as skulls socketed into jewelry. Armor applies a flat damage reduction to physical damage that you take, including physical damage over time, that is a bleed. It also partially reduces the amount of non-physical damage that you take. Specifically, 50% of the damage reduction from your armor contributes to your damage reduction from non-physical sources. However, in higher difficulties, higher world tiers, your armor contributes less and less to non-physical sources. This is to simulate how, like in Diablo 2, as you go up in difficulty, you are getting resistance penalties. So at world tier 3, you only get a 30% contribution from your armor, and at world tier 4, only a 10%, making you very reliant on getting resistances on gear pieces and in other ways. Now, there is a cap on how much damage reduction you can get from armor, and that's 85%. However, the devs expect that you're going to spend most of the game at about 25% damage reduction from armor, and eventually over time you'll build up to about 40% damage reduction from armor on average, unless you're going for a super tanky build. Now, as you go higher up in level, every individual point of armor contributes less and less to your total damage reduction. However, higher level gear has more armor on it, so you don't have to worry about this too much. As you level up, and as you're just normally playing the game and getting better gear, you will see your total damage reduction from armor increase over time. But what this means is that if you, for instance, or for whatever reason, don't change your gear for 20 levels, then you're going to see your damage reduction from armor actually going down as you continue to level up. Now, there's one last factor that's going to affect how much damage reduction you get from armor, and that's your enemy's level. In short, the higher level your enemy is relative to yourself, the less effective your armor is. The lower level they are in relation to you, the more effective your armor is. All right, next up we have attack power. Attack power is not a real number. It's not how much damage you deal. Unlike some other games, there's no game mechanic attached to attack power. It's just the game giving you a rough estimate of how powerful you are, from a damage perspective. So if the number goes up, you are probably dealing more damage. But there's a lot of nuance to that. Attack power factors in the attacks per second of your weapon or weapons, plus your offensive stats that apply to all attacks. So things like crit chance and crit damage are factored in, since those can always apply in all situations, but your damage versus vulnerable targets will not apply because the game can't factor in how often targets are going to be vulnerable. Long story short, overall, don't fuss too much about attack power. Onto attack speed. Your attack speed is based on your weapon's attacks per second, plus any attack speed bonuses you may have. If you are dual wielding, then the game uses the average of your two weapons' attacks per second. There will never be more than two weapons factored into your attack speed. If you are a rogue, then you're either attacking with your ranged weapon or your two melee weapons. You're never attacking with all three at once. So if it's a ranged attack, it's just using the attacks per second of your ranged weapon. If it's a melee, it's the average of your two melees. Similarly for Barbarian, you're either attacking with one of your two-handers, in which case it uses the relevant attacks per second of whatever weapon you're using, or you're attacking with your two one-handers, in which case it uses the average of those two. So about attack speed bonuses. Let's say your weapon deals one attack per second, to make it simple, and you have a 30% attack speed bonus, then you will now be attacking with a speed of 1.3 attacks per second. Attack speed bonuses are additive, so if you have two sources of 10% faster attack speed, those add together to form a 20% attack speed bonus. So you'd go from 1 attack per second to 1.2. All right, onto the Bs. Barrier. Barriers refer to a temporary defensive layer that you get that will soak damage until it's gone before you start taking damage to your life. Different classes have different means of generating barriers, with some classes being very well specialized towards generating barriers. You can make entire builds that revolve around barrier. And you'll see barrier represented by a blue glowing shield over your health globe. Similarly, barriers on enemies are represented by a blue energy glow around their health bar. Alright, basic skills. Whatever your class, your first skill points will be spent on basic skills. These skills will become your default attack, and you'll usually only pick one of them. They don't cost resource, they don't have cooldowns, and depending on your class, they may actually generate resource for you. Onto Berserk or Berserking. Berserking is a temporary condition that I believe only barbarians can get. Who knows if there's some unique that gives it to other characters, but at a baseline, it's a barbarian thing. If you're under the effects of Berserk, you deal 25% additional damage, and your move speed is increased by 15%. And this buff lasts up to 5 seconds. Many different barbarian skills grant Berserking, and you can make entire builds based on Berserk. Onto Bleed or Bleeding. A bleed effect is a physical damage over time effect. That simple. So anything that reduces physical damage will work against bleed. Onto Blood Orbs. A Blood Orb is a necromancer mechanic. Necromancers have a variety of ways to spawn Blood Orbs, and these are equivalent to health globes from Diablo 3. You'll see a Blood Orb spawn as this crimson orb on the battlefield. If you step over it, it'll be consumed and you will instantly heal for 15% of your max life. Necromancers have different ways to build around Blood Orbs. Ways to get different bonuses when they pick up a Blood Orb, or ways to buff the effectiveness of Blood Orbs. Onto Bludgeoning. If you're a barbarian, you're going to see a damage type listed on your weapon, either bludgeoning or slashing. Bludgeoning damage is the damage type dealt by mace-type weapons. Now, damage type is important to barbarians because some skills require weapons or weapon types that deal specific damage, and passive skills may buff different damage types. Now, it seems that slashing weapons are more numerous than bludgeoning weapons. However, barbarians must still fill one of their 4 arsenal slots with a 2-handed bludgeoning weapon. Onto burning. Burning is just fire damage over time. Bonuses to burning do not buff fire damage, but bonuses to fire damage do buff burning. Some fire skills might apply an initial fire damage and then a burn, so bonuses to burning would just affect the damage over time. Next we have channeled. Now, for most skills, you click the button, the skill activates, you're done. If you hold down the button, the skill will activate over and over and over, but each is a distinct and discrete cast of that skill. It'd be no different from you spamming that button as quickly as you can. Channeled skills are skills that you want to hold the button down. These skills will consume an amount of resource per second as long as you're holding down the button, and there's generally some advantage to holding down that button as opposed to spamming it. Chill or chilled. This is a condition that reduces an enemy's move speed. Repeatedly chilling an enemy will freeze it. More on freeze later. Chill effects are generally applied by cold damage. Next we have close, and this is a confusing one. Sometimes the game refers to enemies that are close or enemies that are distant. For example, you might have a skill that knocks back close enemies. This mechanic isn't super clear, but it appears these are binary states. Enemies are either close or they are distant. Now, some people reported that close range is melee, but with some testing, it seems that that range, if it is melee, it's actually farther than most people expect. If you go to the city of Kyovashad and stand on the waypoint, it seems the outer waypoint circle is roughly the close distance. Anything within that circle would be close to you. Next, we have control impaired. When you are crowd controlled, you are considered control impaired. So that means when you're under the effects of either a slow, immobilize, stun, knockback, knockdown, taunt, fear, tether, daze, chill, or freeze. The affix control impaired duration reduction will reduce the amount of time you spend in these crowd controlled states, excluding knockback, which is an instantaneous effect. Cooldown. Quite simply, some skills have a cooldown, let's say 10 seconds, you have to wait 10 seconds before you can use it again, and cooldown reduction will reduce that amount of time. Cooldown reduction stacks multiplicatively. Just like damage reduction, you cannot get 100%. So every additional source of cooldown reduction becomes increasingly less effective. Core skill. Now, whatever your class, the second branch of skills that you unlock on your skill tree, these are your core skills. These skills consume resource to deliver more damage than basic skills. Most builds will use one basic skill and one core skill. When you have the resource, you cast the core skill. When you don't, you cast the basic skill. There's of course a lot more nuance than that. And I hope to see builds emerge as well that shake up this formula of one core and one basic. Core stats. The core stats are strength, intelligence, willpower, and dexterity. Depending on your class and your build, some of these stats may be more important to you than others. But every class generally has one main stat that they care most about, because it's the stat that serves as a multiplier for all their damage. Strength is for the barbarian, willpower is for the druid, intelligence is for the sorcerer and the necromancer, and dexterity is for the rogue. Next we have Crackling Energy. This is a sorcerer mechanic. Some lightning spells can make Crackling Energy spawn, little globes of lightning. If you walk over a Crackling Energy, you collect it, and you get a stack of Crackling Energy, and you can have a maximum of 12 stacks. These will be denoted by little circles above your skill bar. As long as you have at least one stack of Crackling Energy, you'll automatically zap any nearby enemies for a small amount of damage. And every time this happens, it'll consume one of your stacks. There are a lot of interactions with Crackling Energy. It could be a very important mechanic for a lightning build, and generally not for the damage itself, but for interactions with other skills. Like you can have a build that makes you regain mana whenever you pick up Crackling Energy. Next we got Critical Strike Chance. This is a chance to deal bonus damage. When you see a yellow damage number, that's a crit. And that bonus damage is determined by your critical strike damage. Damage over time, however, cannot crit. So if you're a damage over time based build, then you probably don't care about crit chance. Now, everyone has a base amount of crit chance that is equal to 5%, and this can be further increased. Crit chance is an additive bonus. So 2 sources that grant you 5% increased crit chance will add up to 10%. Add that to your base 5 and you're up to 15%. It is possible to reach 100% crit chance. There are no diminishing returns here. Onto critical strike damage. The base extra damage of a crit is 50% additional damage. Within itself, crit damage is additive, so different sources of crit damage will all add up together. So if you have two sources that each give 10%, you get 10 plus your base 50, and therefore 70% crit damage. But that total crit damage is multiplicative with other damage sources. This is a good thing. This means that crits are always a significant source of extra damage. And we're going to talk more about mixing different damage types when we get to D for damage. Onto crowd control, or CC for short. When it applies to you, it's control impaired. When it applies to enemies, it's crowd controlled. So again, slow, immobilize, stun, knockback, knockdown, taunt, fear, tether, dazed, chill, or freeze are all crowd control effects. So sometimes you have damage or skills or some mechanic that revolves around enemies being under the effects of crowd control or crowd controlled enemies. Any of those effects count. However, you cannot apply crowd control effects to bosses. Instead, when you would try to, you fill their stagger meter, and we'll talk more about stagger once we reach S. Then crowd control duration bonus. This increases the duration of your crowd control effects, excluding knockback, which is an instantaneous effect. Alright, damage, which seems like it should be straightforward enough, but specifically we'll talk about damage buckets. This is a key concept that the community has discovered. So damage bonuses come from different sources, and these sources get grouped into 7 different buckets. You'll note that so far in this video we've spoken about additive and multiplicative quite a bit, and in this case every damage bucket is a multiplicative bonus with every other damage bucket, meaning if bucket 1 gives me double damage and bucket 2 also gives me double damage, then those multiply together to quadruple damage, 4 times damage. If I then add in a third bucket that also gives double damage, that's doubling the 4 to make 8 times more damage. Big. But within a specific bucket, all damage sources are additive with each other. So in a bucket, if 2 sources give you double damage, that is plus 100% damage, you add up the plus 100 and the plus 100 to get plus 200%, meaning it's triple damage, not quadruple. If you then add in a third source within the bucket of another plus 100% damage, then it's 100 plus 100 plus 100, that's plus 300, or quadruple damage, rather than 8 times damage. And the more individual sources within the bucket, the greater the diminishing returns. So every added source of extra damage contributes less and less and less. What this means is that adding more buckets is generally more beneficial than adding more sources within a bucket. We can do a whole video on damage buckets, but for now, this is the simple version. Anything that says damage from is put into one bucket. For example, damage from golem. Anything that says damage with is another bucket, like damage with core skills. Anything that says damage while is another bucket, like damage while healthy. Anything that says damage versus is another bucket, like damage versus stunned. Then your class's core main stat is its own bucket, crit damage is its own bucket, and vulnerable damage is its own bucket. So basically, all you really need to take away from this is that you want to be getting damage bonuses from as many different buckets as possible. It's generally more beneficial to diversify your portfolio of buckets before you continue to invest into multiple sources within a single bucket. Alright, next we have damage over time, or DOT for short. Instead of dealing damage in a single instance, a DOT spreads out damage over a period of seconds. The game will generally give you the total damage output and the total time. It's not going to tell you the damage per second. Effects that buff the base damage type of the DOT will buff the DOT, but not vice versa. Most DOTs seem to stack, with each DOT basically just dealing its own damage and being treated as its own thing. So hitting an enemy with a DOT twice, it's not going to prolong the timer, it's not going to overwrite each other, it's just going to be 2 different stacks of the DOT, and each will expire on its own. There's some weird exceptions where sometimes recasting the same DOT on an enemy will instead refresh the DOT duration. Basically, it just overrides the previous cast of the DOT, but this seems to be the exception rather than the rule. In general, it seems fair to assume at a baseline that DOTs stack, but always read the skill description just to see if you can glean any extra context. Alright, Dazed. This is a crowd control condition that makes enemies unable to attack or use skills, but still able to move. Dexterity. Dex contributes to your dodge chance. More dex, the higher your dodge chance. For rogue, dex gives you more damage. And for barbarian and sorcerer, dex gives you more crit chance. Distant. We explained this when we spoke about close. Basically, if you're not close, you are distant. Dodge chance. Dodge chance is a chance to avoid taking damage altogether. As you build up dodge chance, every subsequent bonus becomes less and less effective. You cannot achieve 100% dodge chance. This is the same like resistance. If you're hit with a damage over time effect, you cannot dodge individual damage ticks, but you might be able to dodge the initial hit that applied the dot. If you're standing in a damage pool, though, just don't stand in it. That's how you dodge it. Dual-wielded weapon damage. While you're dual-wielding, both the attack speed and the damage of your two weapons is averaged out. It's not going to alternate one or the other, or preferentially pick one, it just averages them. You do retain all affixes, however, on all your items at any time. Affixes are not averaged or used situationally. If you have +1 to a skill on any of your weapons, whether you're using that weapon or not, it's always contributing to you. Fear. This is a crowd control effect that makes the target run away for a short duration. While under the effects of fear, targets cannot attack, and they're just going to try to run away from you. Fortify. Okay, this is a mechanic unique to Diablo 4. Oh, Fortify, okay. If you are fortified, you take 10% less damage. How do you become fortified? Well, you become fortified when your Fortify value is equal to or greater than your current life. How do you get Fortify? Well, certain skills or items can grant Fortify, but you can never have more Fortify than your total life. So you can sort of think of Fortify as a second life pool. But when you take damage, you lose an equal amount of life and Fortify. Now, your Fortify is represented by a thin red glow around the inside of your health globe. Not to be confused with the healthy indicator, that is a thin red line on the outside of the health globe. So outside and not glowing, that is healthy indicator. Inside glow, that is Fortify. Different skills or items can increase the damage reduction you get from Fortify, and some classes are better able to build around Fortify, like Druids and Barbarians. Fortify's damage reduction also applies against barriers, so if you are fortified and have a barrier, your barrier will take 10% less damage. Fortify also synergizes with a mechanic called Overpower. Basically, more Fortify means more Overpower damage, but we'll talk about Overpower later. By itself, Fortify isn't amazing, it's just an occasional 10% damage reduction. But if you can build around fortified buffs and also maintain a fortified state by ensuring you are generating Fortify faster than you're healing, then Fortify can be really good. Alright, onto Frozen or Freeze. This is a crowd control state. The target is frozen solid, unable to move or do anything. And if they're killed while in this state, they shatter to pieces, meaning they can be resurrected by other monsters. Something that is frozen is also considered chilled, for purposes of buffs against chilled monsters. Basically, consider frozen to be 100% chilled. Chilled is something that you can apply repeatedly to enemies. So an enemy that is under a chill effect is some percentage chilled. If you keep chilling them, that percentage increases, and once it reaches 100% chilled, then they are frozen. You're filling an invisible chill meter. Healthy. If you are currently at over 80% of your max life, you are considered in the healthy state. You'll know if you're in the healthy state or not because you'll have a thin red line around your health globe when you are healthy. Some skills, for instance, let you deal more damage against healthy enemies, and there's no easy way to tell when an enemy is healthy, so just estimate whenever their health bar is at least 4/5 full. Immobilize. This is another crowd control effect. An immobilized target cannot move, but it can still attack or use abilities. Immune. This is a state that you can be in. If you are immune, you cannot be damaged or crowd controlled, and if you are currently crowd controlled, your CC is removed. Injured. This is a state that you or an enemy can be in. Injured characters have less than 35% of their max life. You may be able to make a build that revolves around dealing more damage to injured enemies. And again, there's no easy indicator for that, so just roughly, if you see that their health bar is down to a third or less, then they're injured. Intelligence. This stat gives you 0.5% resistance to all elements per point. For Sorcerer, you get more damage per point, and for Rogue, you get more crit chance per point. Key Passive. Key passives are the final nodes on your skill tree. Every class has a few to choose from, and you can only select one. Key passives are very powerful and tend to be build defining. Knockback. Knockback is an instantaneous crowd control effect. It knocks someone away from the attacker in the direction that the attack came. Things that extend or reduce crowd control duration have no effect on knockback since it's instantaneous. Knockdown. This is knockback's evil brother. This is another crowd control condition, and it makes the target fall down and unable to move or act at all. You can build around knocking down enemies and dealing more damage to knocked down enemies. Level. I mean, that's obvious, but what does a level give you? Every level, your life increases, plus your core stats also increase. Every level until 50, you get a skill point. Then after that, every quarter level, you gain 1 Paragon point. So 4 Paragon per level after level 50. The max level in the game is level 100, meaning you'll gain 200 Paragon points just from leveling, and a few other Paragon points from other game systems. And again, the level difference between you and a monster will apply damage reduction. Alright, life. I mean, this is simple. This is how many hit points you have. You take damage, your life goes down, it reaches 0, you die. Your life naturally increases as you level up, plus items and skills can increase your life. Lucky hit chance and lucky hit effect. Alright, this is a big one that's going to cause a lot of confusion for a lot of people. For those who know what proc chance is, lucky hit chance is proc chance. That's it. Simple as that. If you don't know what proc chance is, then let's dive in. Every skill that hits an enemy has a base chance to trigger a lucky hit when you hit an enemy. A lucky hit does nothing by itself. It doesn't do extra damage, it doesn't crowd control an enemy. What it does is it gives you a chance to trigger a lucky hit effect. And you get lucky hit effects from either skills or items or some passives. So for instance, one lucky hit effect could be when you land a lucky hit, you reset the cooldown on one of your skills. So let's say you're using a skill that has a 50% lucky hit chance. Then that means that half the time you hit an enemy, you're going to reset the cooldown on your skill. In this example of having that as your lucky hit effect. Again, lucky hit does nothing by itself, we're just giving an example. Now here's where things become a little bit more tricky. Lucky hit effects generally have a chance to trigger of their own. So for instance, it might be a 10% chance. So for that same example, it could be on lucky hit, you have a 10% chance to reset the cooldown of your skill. So following that, let's say you're using a skill that has a 50% lucky hit chance, and your lucky hit effect is a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown. Then in practice, this means that whenever you hit an enemy, there's a 5% chance to trigger that lucky hit. 50% of the 10%. Or 10% of the 50%, the math works out both ways. You're just taking the percentage of the percentage. If you have advanced tooltips enabled, which please do, you will see your lucky hit chance. In general, more single target skills will have a higher lucky hit chance than skills that hit multiple enemies at once. Then gear or passives can further modify your lucky hit chance. Extra sources of lucky hit chance add together. So 4 sources of 5% will add up to 20% extra lucky hit chance. But that 20% bonus is added to the final number. So remember how in our previous example we said that we worked out to 5% of the time we are landing a lucky hit on enemies? This would mean you're getting 20% more of that final number, so the 5% becomes a 6%. It doesn't become a 25%. Lucky hits can be something you either do or don't care about, depending on how you build your character. Movement speed. The max movement speed bonus you can get in Diablo 4 is 200%. That's where you're capped. This includes bonuses from all sources. You cannot surpass double speed. Overpower. Alright, this is going to be another big one, new to Diablo 4. Whenever you hit an enemy, there's a 3% chance for you to apply extra damage called Overpower damage. So, little bit similar to crits. When you see light blue damage numbers, those are Overpower hits. Dark orange damage numbers, those are crits that also overpowered. Now, the base Overpower damage is 50% extra damage. Then Overpower also deals bonus damage that is the sum of your current life, not total life, plus any Fortify you have. And you can further buff this Overpower damage with different skills and items, and Willpower inherently buffs Overpower damage for all classes. However, damage over time, passive abilities, and channeled skills like Whirlwind cannot overpower. You cannot normally raise that 3% chance to overpower. What you can do is, with some skills, you can under the right conditions, guarantee an Overpower hit. Tanky builds that stack Fortify benefit the most from Overpower, with the Druid in particular and even the Barbarian having many tools in order to build around Overpower damage. But here's the thing about Overpower damage. As of right now, with the way its damage seems to scale, primarily based around your life and your Fortify and Overpower damage bonus, it seems as though Overpower damage is actually underpowered in the endgame. It seems like it just adds a flat damage bonus that won't get multiplied by other damage sources. And the higher in level you go, the more inconsequential that damage bonus is relative to all your other damage bonuses. In early game, this flat damage bonus can be incredibly strong. You can probably use a leveling build that benefits tremendously from Overpower. However, I don't expect to see any of the top builds at level 100, the endgame ultimate builds, using Overpower. It just doesn't seem like they'll contribute enough damage to make it worth building around Overpower. Now, I'll note that I said it seems a lot. Again, the game isn't even out yet, and the Overpower mechanic isn't fully understood. And maybe even for Season 1, they're going to rebalance it if it is underpowered. Again, if any of this info becomes obsolete or incorrect, I'll update this video description or I'll release a new video. Alright, physical damage. This includes bleeding damage, i.e. physical damage over time. Poisoning. Okay, there's poison damage and then there's poisoning damage. Poisoning damage is the dot. So something that buffs poisoning damage is only buffing the poison damage over time, not base poison damage. Potion capacity, very simply, this is how many potion charges you can store, and this can be increased with items or via zone progress through the Renown system. Renown, this is a gameplay system that we're gonna just very briefly summarize. It rewards you for completing different activities within a region. Renown is tracked separately for all 5 regions, and it can include very important rewards like skill points, potion charges, and paragon points, so don't ignore the Renown system. Resistance. Alright, there are a few different types of resistance: fire, cold, lightning, poison, and shadow. Those are your 5 elements. Resistance reduces the amount of damage you take from these sources, and it applies to both the dot and non-dot versions of all of these effects. Your total damage reduction versus any of these elements is made up of 50%, half of it comes from your armor, and the other half comes from your resistance. So if you have 20% fire resistance, that reduces the fire damage you take by 10%, with the other contribution coming from half of your armor damage reduction. And as we covered when we spoke about armor, as you go up in difficulty, higher world tiers, your armor will contribute less to your damage reduction from elements, and therefore becomes increasingly important to stack resistance. However, as you stack resistance, additional sources become less effective, so you cannot achieve 100% damage reduction. This also means that it's going to be better to have one source of resist that gives a lot of resist than multiple sources that give tiny amounts. Slashing. As we explained with Bludgeoning, slashing is the other weapon damage type that barbarians have access to. Again, some skills require slashing weapons, and barbarians must fill one of their 4 weapon slots with a 2-handed slashing weapon. Slow. This is another crowd control effect, and it reduces move speed for a short time. This isn't known for sure yet, but it does seem that slow and chill are 2 separate effects, in that chilled enemies are not also under the effects of slow. Both effects reduce movement speed, but technically a chilled enemy does not count as slowed, so if you deal extra damage to slowed enemies, I don't believe that's going to work against chilled enemies. This is not 100% sure, however, and if we get contradictory evidence, again, I'll update the description. Stagger. Okay. Some enemies you fight, big, important enemies like world bosses, will be immune to crowd control effects, and instead they're going to have a stagger bar. So whenever you hit an enemy with an effect that would otherwise crowd control a different enemy, instead of getting crowd controlled, you're going to add to their stagger bar. That stagger bar will continue to fill and fill and fill, and once it reaches its max, the enemy becomes staggered. When staggered, a boss is considered to be under all crowd control effects, and that's for the entire duration of the stagger, which seems to be about 12 seconds. Additionally, world bosses will have unique effects that apply once they are staggered, and that can alter the rest of the fight, generally in a way that's beneficial to the player. So, in the case of Ashava, for instance, the world boss, when you stagger her, you break off one of her arm blades, thereby making the rest of the fight easier. Stealth. This is a condition. It seems to mostly be useful for rogues, but again, who knows if some unique item will let it apply to other classes. While you are under the effects of stealth, you cannot be directly targeted by enemies. If you use an attack or you take damage, you lose the stealth condition. Stealth also might have some duration. A number of rogue abilities revolve around entering stealth or benefiting from stealth. Strength. Every point of strength gives you 1 point of armor. For the barbarian, more strength gives him more damage, and for rogue, more strength gives more resource generation. Stun or stunned. This is another crowd control condition. A stunned enemy cannot attack, use skills, or move. Taunt. Taunt is a crowd control effect that forces the target to target the caster for some amount of time. Tether. Tether is a crowd control effect that will stop a creature from walking outside of a given radius. So you might see this applied to yourself when an enemy summons some kind of pillar with chains. The chain is attached to you and you can still move freely within the radius, a specific chain radius around that pillar, but you cannot move outside of it. Thorns. Thorns is damage that is dealt back to the attacker. So if you have thorns and someone hits you, they take your thorns damage. Thorns damage does not apply to attacks that are entirely damage over time effects. So if you're hit with a dot that deals an initial damage and then a dot, the initial damage will trigger the thorns, but the subsequent ticks of the dot will not. Thorns damage is buffed by your core main stat. You can stack Thorns bonuses as affixes on your gear. Iron Barb elixirs will grant you bonus Thorns damage for 30 minutes, and different skills can use Thorns. Thorns builds may be a thing, particularly for Barbarian and maybe Necromancer. Ultimate. Now, whatever your class, you will eventually unlock the ability to spend skill points into ultimate skills, or specifically just one. Ultimate skills generally have very long cooldowns. Roughly a minute, sometimes more, sometimes less, but they deal big damage or otherwise have very significant effects. You don't have to take an ultimate. If you do, you can only select one ultimate, but it's ultimately your choice whether you want to build around an ultimate or not. You have to sacrifice a slot on your skill bar for a very long cooldown. I think in the meta we're going to see some builds using ultimates and some that won't. Unstoppable. Unstoppable makes you immune to crowd control and will instantly break any crowd control that is active on you. In my experience, it's a really good idea to keep some unstoppable skill on your skill bar. You get hit with a hard CC like a freeze, man, does it feel good to be able to just instantly pop out of that. Now, elite monsters will become unstoppable after they've been hit with enough hard CCs. And this is just a balance thing to prevent them from being permanently crowd controlled. You'll know they're unstoppable because you're going to see above their head a little broken chain icon appear. Vulnerable. Alright, vulnerable is a condition that can be applied to enemies, or enemies can apply to you, that lasts for a short duration, and by default, enemies who are vulnerable, or anyone who is vulnerable, takes 20% increased damage. But with gear or paragon or skills, you can increase the amount of damage you deal versus vulnerable enemies. If you are vulnerable, you will see on your health globe this shattered glass texture. Definitely be wary while you're vulnerable. You might want to back out of combat for a bit, or pop a defensive skill or a potion. If an enemy is vulnerable, they'll have a purple glow around their health bar. Vulnerable is a super useful stat, especially in party player versus world bosses, because it benefits everyone. If that enemy is made vulnerable by just one person, everyone gets that 20% or more damage buff. Every class seems to be able to make a build that revolves around vulnerable, but rogues are especially good at it. And as we discussed with the damage buckets, vulnerable is its own damage multiplier. So if you deal 50% increased damage to vulnerable targets, that's always going to be 50%. It's not going to get clumped in with other damage bonuses and therefore actually be dealing less than 50% additional damage. So in practice, this means that no matter what your build is, it's almost always beneficial to work in some vulnerable damage. Unless you are literally never making enemies vulnerable and never playing with anyone else who is making enemies vulnerable. Weapon speed. We kind of already covered this, but basically your weapon speed refers to your weapon's attacks per second prior to any bonuses. When dual wielding, these numbers are averaged. And your weapon speed serves as the base calculation for your attack speed. And lastly, willpower. Willpower grants more healing received per point. It gives more overpower damage per point. And for Barb and Sorcerer, it gives more resource generation per point. And that is going to wrap up this video. Again, I'll try to keep things in the description updated with any new information and make future videos if necessary. If there are any additional tips related to any of this or any corrections or clarifications that you would like to add, feel free to drop them in the comments below. Or if you have any questions as well, feel free to drop them and I'll see if I can address them either as a response, directly to your comment, or in a future video. Because do stay tuned for more Diablo 4 guides. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Riker's Raiders for more Diablo 4 content.